Donald Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence also spoke in Washington. He may turn out to be a potential 2024 rival for the Republican nomination. He appeared to separate himself from his former boss, describing an agenda for the future and called on the party to not look backwards. When asked about the growing divide between Trump and himself, a man who was once the former president's most loyal sidekick, Pence said the two do not differ on issues.
Now, some people may choose to focus on the past, but elections are about the future. And I believe conservatives must focus on the future to win back America. We can't afford to take our eyes off the road in front of us, because what's at stake is the very survival of our way of life. When conservatives focus on winning the future, we won't just win the next election. We will change the course of American history for generations. I don't know that the president and I differ on issues, but we may differ on focus. I truly do believe that elections are about the future, and that it's absolutely essential at a time when so many Americans are hurting, so many families are struggling, that we don't give way to the temptation to look back.
For more on this, we can cross live to Washington and join Arise U.S. correspondent Eric Ham. Eric, thank you so much for joining us on Newsday. Now, let's start with Donald Trump's return to D.C. What else did the former president have to say other than repeating his false claims that the election was stolen?
Well, what the president did on his return back to Washington since leaving office was he gave us a full view of what he actually would do if he were now in office. He talked about crime. He talked about how he would go after implementing more policies to deal with crime, such as bringing in National Guard. What we saw was the president basically continuing to double down on many of those same policies that we saw took place in the aftermath of the George Floyd verdict, as well as the George Floyd killing. We saw a former president who continued to double down on this idea that not only was the election stolen and the election rigged, but also he talked about how that also continued to shape the nation and how there needed to be a course correction. And so what we're seeing here is a bit of a preview from the former president, not only when or if he decides to run for office, but also what it would look like when, in fact, he was in office. And of course, this not only was the return for the former president, but also we saw these dueling events taking place between the former president as well as his former vice president, Mike Pence.
Meanwhile, former Vice President Mike Pence also delivered his own speech in Washington, where he sought to paint his own vision and a possible run at the White House. Could you tell us more?
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting because the former Vice President Mike Pence was actually scheduled to speak on Monday, so it wasn't designed to be opposing speeches taking place on the exact same day. There was a scheduling conflict due to weather issues, and so what we saw was the former Vice President actually speaking on the same day. But he talked about not looking back, looking forward, and many, of course, saw this as a former Vice President who is not only trying to provide some daylight between himself and his president, Donald Trump, but also trying to have it both ways, saying that it's time to move on, which many took that as it's time to move on from the Trump presidency, but at the same time providing like glowing compliments of the former president and also what they did in office. And again, one comment, of course, that stood out that is getting a lot of traction from his speech is when he said that conservatism is bigger than a party or an individual or person, which many, of course, thought that meant he was speaking directly about the former president himself, Donald Trump.
Now, if Trump decides to run again, will other Republicans have the courage to take him on?
I think that is the $64,000 question. There are many at one time who said that they would not run if, in fact, Donald Trump decided to run again for president. However, what we're now beginning to see is there are those who might be actually still planning to run if the former president decides to get in. We know many are touting the current governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis. Also, many believe the moves that are now being made by Mike Pence himself suggest that he is also planning to get into the race in 2024. And we cannot forget the Republican senator from South Carolina, Tim Scott, who right now has amassed a very massive war chest that many believe is also a plan for him to get in. So even though right now Donald Trump is still the titular head of the party, right now he is ahead of his closest competitor by more than 30 points. And he's got a war chest of more than $250 million already. This still could be not only perhaps one of the most expensive primaries in U.S. history, but it also could still be one of the most crowded as well.
Arise U.S. correspondent Eric Ham, thank you so much for joining us on Newsday.